Welcome, everyone, to the Gamification Report, episode 12. We've got some fabulous new things to talk about this week. We're going to be talking this week about two main topics that are going to occupy our time in the short broadcast. We're going to be looking at gender and cultural differences in game-based learning, and that's really interesting stuff. We're going to break down some stereotypes and hopefully not introduce new stereotypes, but new knowledges and wisdom, which leads us to the segue of our second part of this broadcast, which has to do with multiple intelligence and player-centered game design. So we're kind of talking about game design as it's geared towards the individual and how the individual is impacted by gender and culture. Sound good? There's a paper we're going to start with by Lukosh and their team in 2017, which looks at gender and gamification and gameplay. We want to start by looking, this is a screen capture of a game called Fortnight. Now, some of you might be playing this now. It's a free game. It's available as an app. And what's interesting is it's very, very successful. It's a 2018 game. Players are basically killing each other off in an open world environment, like a hunting game where you kind of have to run around and other players, you have to eliminate them. And then there are times the whole world kind of implodes and gets tighter and tighter, like a dust storm forms, and then you're all forced into areas, so it forces the action. Now, what's really interesting about Fortnite is that this has being played by a lot of women, a lot of female players. There's a lot of female avatars. So what you're seeing is this picture of a female avatar. In most video games, classically, there's usually male characters, and you can pick a female character if you want. But then again, there's a lot of male players, and this shows a big shift because we know a lot of women are playing this, and when you actually get into the game, most of the avatars and characters you can choose have a female appearance. So this breaks down a bit of a stereotype that women like to play things and play with fuzzy kittens and play Sims and have a little house, and that men like to shoot to kill. Well, it's not true, because women are loving shooting and killing, and men are enjoying themes like Civilization, where you actually build things. So again, a lot of the stereotypes we have about games and their development need to be set aside, especially if we're building games for learning. So what Lukosh did in her study, she started with a microgame study on what was in planning operations. So basically this microgame was the idea of planning, and you could imagine any kind of planning in any kind of industry. So you're essentially looking at a game which is designed to look at the process of planning and logistics and strategy. And they began to explore in this paper how gender and culture were explored. So how did people in the microgame vary based on gender and culture? So basically, it was a 2-hour game that was a yard where there were loading and unloading operations. So you had single and multiplayer versions. So you were in this yard and you had to, get these skids and kind of move them around and make a plan. And so they took 170 students in both the culture and gender experiments, and they used Mann-Whitney U statistics. And Mann-Whitney U's are very useful for finding differences that are between groups. The question that statistics like Mann-Whitney U and Kruskal-Wallis statistics answer is, are the differences between groups greater than the differences within groups? And they found that female players had a higher mean score, which meant that female players were more effective at planning than male players. They then used the Kruskal-Wallis, which we've just talked about, to look at the differences in culture. So they had 42 Dutch players, 39 Chinese players, 37 American players, and you can see a German and others. And it was interesting that the Dutch and the German players in the study beat the other cultural groups, and they spent some time in the study trying to analyze why there might be some cultural differences. So when they looked at it, when they had a team with a balanced gender composition and uniform nationality perform better than a team which had Dutch males and one Chinese female. So this idea that homogeneous teams perform better than heterogeneous teams because they have a common background helps them to show agreement, give opinions, and demonstrate various emotions with minimal inhibitions. It could be, for example, that in the Asian woman, in her category, it might be that there might be criticisms of decisions of team members, and that leadership roles might be downplayed, that Asian women may, for example, feel less leadership contextually in a game world than an American player. So these are interesting things. There's a lot of research that underlies it, as you can imagine, a lot of nuanced researchers. And what's really interesting is there's a whole emerging body of evidence that we get along with other people because of similar neural clusters in the brain. And we'll probably come back to looking at that a bit later on. But what we're learning is that people that think like you tend to have similar wiring to your brain. So you've had friends you've had your whole life and you kind of think the same way, you like the same kind of movies, there seems to be a biological basis, and that may be much stronger than the cultural basis that we're looking at. Or it may be that cultural norms interact with this. So, dude looks like a lady. Dudes versus ladies. What happened? What we found out in this game is that female players outperformed the male population for planning tasks in technical environments. This breaks down a stereotype, doesn't it? That somehow men are the big, great planners and that women are, I don't know what. Cultural ascriptions of women in the labor force have been demeaning, to say the least. But this is an idea. But what's interesting is when you look at the study, male individuals tend to perform in all studies better in virtual environments and games. So there's differences in spatial abilities that have been noted in the area. So that women may feel, for example, if they're in an underground dungeon in a game and they have to explore and get out, they feel a lot more of anxiety trying to find their way out. Male players seem to be a little more comfortable. Now, that's not true for me. I get involved in an underground dungeon. I get so lost I actually log out of the game or ask for help. But there's a lot of anxiety in virtual environments. So there may be abilities to use interfaces that actually lie at the difference in game performance in male and female. So here's a Fortnight character, again giving you the idea that you can really customize and create these characters that represent yourself. And if you see yourself as represented, a female player sees herself represented in this kind of graphics, they're more interested in the game. So can we conclude then that women plan better and men spatialize better? There was some other study in Nagliari and Rohan in 2001. They found that girls were much better in planning attention tasks as a result of tests based on planning attention and simultaneous cognitive processing theory. And the gender differences still seem to hold up. Women seem to perform better in verbal and memory tasks, while men do better in spatial cognition and spatial learning. This is well held up in the literature. So it appears that this transfers to gamification. So when you're building games for learning, when you're building game worlds and learning experiences, it's good to take these gender differences into account, the same way we try to take different player types into account. And then when we talk about cultural uniqueness, this gets interesting too. I mean, if you go to Korea, a lot of the online multiplayer role-playing games may involve giant parades with thousands of characters, and a lot of these Korean players have very, very developed connections with other players in these open game worlds. Whereas games like World of Warcraft, people are kind of on their own. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they don't. So they begin to analyze it in terms of cultural difference. And culture is a very charged word, but for example, he would talk about in this study German culture being characterized as a culture of small power distance, being more collective, uncertainty tolerant, and rather achievement oriented. Whereas in the Netherlands, there's cultural studies showing that they have a smaller power distance, more individualistic, with a higher level of uncertainty tolerance, but mainly cooperation oriented. The culture of the United States would be characterized with comparable power distance, that is, that it's a nation that's kind of built on the idea of equality, and not that's necessarily expressed in the real world, but the idea of being highly individualistic and having less uncertainty tolerance in Germany and the Netherlands. So we can see that Western European and American participants might have uncertainty avoidance as a flexible difference in culture. And this is interesting. It kind of comes back to Nick Yee's work. Nick Yee is a big researcher in the area of video games, and this comes back to a 2006 paper where he looked at player types and gender. And when they looked at the actual game performance, male players scored higher on achievement components than female players, whereas female players scored significantly higher than males in relationship subcomponents. But male players seem to socialize just as much in the game as female players, but they seem to be looking for different things in those relationships. And in fact, Nick Yee then reports that age is shown to have a much greater impact in game preference than gender. So it's of not certain waters, but we certainly understand one thing from this. You can build games with a variety of settings for both genders without resorting to the stereotypes that men prefer killing and women prefer little fuzzy cats and pink popcorn and days at the fair with the circus with their boyfriends. This whole idea that we've put women into these images of the man going to the county fair and throwing baseballs to win her a nice prize. These kinds of things are really good in the movies, but they don't hold up in the real world very well. We're beginning to understand that it's not as simple as we thought of. We want to now segue into the work of Pejman Sajadi in 2017, a fascinating study that we really need to look at here, and that is a theory of multiple intelligence in games for the purpose of player-centered design. So he's using Gardner's model, 1983, and this idea that we have multiple forms of intelligence. So we can see, for example, there are people that are linguistically gifted, so they can read and write stories, and they learn by saying and hearing and seeing words, etc. And their learning activities, you see, might be memory games and trivia. Then we have the logical, mathematical type of intelligence. These might be solving puzzles, exploring patterns. So you would learn by asking questions and categorizing and working with patterns, and you might be solving puzzles and problem solving. We have visual spatial learning, musical, body, kinesthetic, interpersonal, naturalistic. And there are some new additions to this, but is that we have different forms of intelligence. So to say you have a high IQ, remember the professor on Gilligan's Island who seemed to know everything. That's not really how it is. You might have an incredible bodily kinesthetic awareness that would then have you doing various things in a game world or in learning, such as moving, touching, or doing. Or you might have a high interpersonal intelligence in which you want to be cooperating in working groups and sharing. So there's these 8 different types of intelligence that are summarized, and you can follow this up in the literature, but you can think about all the different kinds of needs. Here's Lego. Lego, as we know, these kind of Lego facilitators are very big in gamification now. So we begin to think of game design for learning in terms of multiple intelligence, and it kind of changes how we look at it. So in the studies, what they did is they looked at 47 different game titles that were selected, and they looked at each intelligence dimension you see on the left, whether it was visual, spatial, body, kinesthetic, musical, etc. And so then they began to select games which connected to these intelligence. So the World of Warcraft was visual spatial, you're in a big open world. Minecraft, which played by a lot of kids right now, very good at visual spatial. Let's look at the bottom of naturalist, would be endless ocean, spore, planted green in Africa, where people have connections to nature. Logical, mathematical would be The Room, Heavy Rain, L.A. Noire. Guitar Hero, Rock Band, and Just Dance might be for musical intelligence. And you can see in bodily kinesthetic, we're all familiar with these Connect Sports and Dance Revolution and these kind of nunchucks that you use in terms of Wii's. So you have bodily kinesthetic. So it's interesting. He's making connections here between the different intelligence dimension and the game example. So what they did is they recruited 97 females and 211 males who responded to the study. And then they developed, through statistics, clusters that connected multiple intelligence type to the game mechanic. And then they began to ask, what makes certain games preferred by players who exhibit dominance for certain multiple intelligence? What makes you grab a game, depending on your intelligence strength? So then they did a cluster analysis showing that at least half the games correlated to a given MI dimension, a positive or negative cluster. And then they could come up with a recommender tool. The conclusions they arrived at are that gamers' multiple intelligence dimensions and preference have strong relationships, and they cannot be explained by simply game genres saying this is about fighting, this is about driving, etc., but that they're connected to the actual process that goes on in the game, and that there are evidence-based mappings between mechanics and different multiple intelligence dimensions which exist. So this is fascinating stuff. We hope that you keep a look on it, that when we build games, we're trying to reach people in this particular kind of intelligence. We're also trying to cut through gender and cultural models to make games that are much more appealing. We've got a report coming up in podcast 16 where we'll be looking at First Nations, Indigenous education, and how game worlds can help reduce the barriers that we see in STEM participation. I think that this has been very helpful for you today. I hope you've had a lot of fun learning. We've certainly had a lot of fun talking about it, and we'll see you in future broadcasts.